Okay, good morning, everyone. I think it is time to start our Sunday Forum. I am Jeff Peckrell, the leader of Sunday Forum here at UUSF, and our co-leads on this project are Dolores Perez Heilbrunn, who I'll introduce in a moment or two, and Melvin Starks, who was at the breakfast table. If you haven't already taken some food, please do. We have wonderful food for you here today. Before we move into today's program, I just want to say that this is the first Sunday Forum of the fall season, and Dolores, Melvin, and I and others have been working very hard to plan a lot of exciting programming for you this fall. We have Sunday Forums every Sunday practically until December. And so next Sunday we have Richard Hardigan, who's going to give a presentation about the migrant crisis in Europe. And the week after that we have Mark Ginsburg, who will speak about the Cuba embargo. So these are both very important and interesting topics, and I hope you will come back for those. Now I'm going to introduce David Heilbrunn, who's going to give our Ohlone recognition, and after that, Dolores will introduce speakers, Supervisor Preston. Thank you.
Good morning. We, the members of the First Unitarian Universalist Society of San Francisco, acknowledge that our community is located on the unceded ancestral homeland of the Ramaytush Ohlone tribes, the original inhabitants of the San Francisco Peninsula. We recognize that we benefit from living and working here, and we affirm their sovereign rights as First Peoples. The Greater Bay Area is also the ancestral home of the Miwok, Yokuts, Patwin, and other tribes. As the original stewards of this land, the indigenous peoples understood the interconnectedness of all things and maintained harmony with nature for millennia. We honor them now for their enduring commitment to Mother Earth. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, David. I left out one important thing when I did my announcements, which is the Q&A process. We would like to have you hold your questions until the end. I think there should be cards. If not, we'll get some out. You can write them down. And Robin and I will be collecting the cards. Also, if you are on the Zoom call, just chat your questions, and I'll be collating those there, and we'll ask them mostly all at the end. Okay? Thank you very much. And now, Dolores Perez Heilbrunn will introduce Supervisor Preston.
Yes, good morning. We're so happy to have Dean Preston here with us. And he is the elected representative of District 5 on the San Francisco Board of Supervisors, serving the Tenderloin, Fillmore, Western Addition, Hayes Valley, Lower Pacific Heights, Japantown, Alamo Square, north of Panhandle, the Haight Ashbury, and the Lower Haight. Dean won a special election in 2019 to become the city's first Democratic Socialist elected San Francisco in 40 years. He was reelected to a full term in 2020. On the Board of Supervisors, Dean has championed anti-eviction measures, social housing, public transportation, housing for homeless people, criminal justice reform, and taxes on the rich as part of his effort to create a more sustainable and equitable city. Prior to taking office, Dean worked as a tenant attorney and founded California's only statewide tenant organization. He helped lead the successful fight to save rent control in 2008. In 2018, he wrote and championed Proposition F, San Francisco's groundbreaking law to provide legal representation for all tenants during the pandemic. He has championed ballot measures that have raised hundreds of millions of dollars for rent relief and affordable housing. Dean has lived in District 5 for 30 years. He is a public school parent, an everyday Muni rider, a former small business owner, and affordable housing advocate. As a democratic socialist, Dean advocates for fundamental change
Too low for me, too.
at the local, state, and national levels. He believes everyone deserves a dignified, productive, and healthy life through universal policies like Medicare for all, free education, and social housing. Welcome, Dean. We're so happy you're here.
All right, let me know if you cannot hear me, but I thank you so much for this opportunity. And as I was discussing with some folks, you get a lot of opportunities when you're in politics to speak in sound bites and to talk to people for 30 seconds or a minute. Rarer are the opportunities to actually come together, spend some time really discussing issues in depth. And so I really welcome this opportunity to take some time to speak with you all and to take questions. I was asked to speak about the future of our city, so no problem, just a small topic that we will tackle in the upcoming minutes. But I actually appreciate the opportunity to step back and to think about and talk about the future of our city. I think we are very much in San Francisco at a crossroads with some important decisions to make. Residents of this city want a city that's safe, that's affordable, that is healthy, family-friendly, and functions well, whether that's public transit or trash being picked up or schools or whatever the issue is. People want the city to function well, people want results, and people really want fundamentally a city that works. I think that's what probably everyone agrees on. But there are, and I think we need to really recognize that there are competing visions on how we get those results in San Francisco, on what works and what doesn't, and on the reasons that we have some of the challenges that we have in San Francisco. I think there is one view that we need to be acting really boldly to improve our city, that we need to be focusing on evidence-based solutions, care for the needs of the most vulnerable in our city, fundamentally valuing people over profits, and really doubling down on being a kind and inclusive city. I think that is one view and perspective. Unfortunately, there's another view that is increasingly getting traction, and that is what I would characterize as an increasingly punitive view, where we punish those who are poor, vilify those who are struggling and marginalized, and push people out of sight rather than solving the challenges that they face, and push folks out of sight either into jail or out of the city. So I take the inclusive view, the first one I described, not just because I think it's the moral thing to do, but also because it actually works. It actually works to improve life for all of us, and I'll be talking a bit more about that. So I do think to understand the path forward, we need to learn from our recent past, and I think there's a lot to learn. I think we need to look at the last few years so we're clear about what's at stake, about what works and what doesn't work when it comes to addressing the biggest challenges and making our city safer and more livable and more inclusive. So I want to start with what I think is a difficult truth, but it's not a given for a lot of folks these days. And that is that policies that punish the poor and deny people their basic needs are the cause, not the solution of our current problems. And I believe very strongly that the last few years absolutely prove that that's the case. So the solutions lie in what we started doing early in the pandemic, before the billionaires, real estate speculators, and venture capitalists revolted and demanded an end to policies that were starting to work. And what we see today in terms of worsening homelessness, crime, overdose fatalities, and divisiveness and toxicity in our politics is the direct result of their interference with progress and their rollout of harmful reactionary policies. So as I said, I think we're very much at a crossroads. Billionaires and their enablers and big corporations and venture capitalists and real estate moguls, they are engaged in what can only be described as an attempted hostile takeover of San Francisco. This becomes clearer every day, and we either accept this hostile takeover attempt or we meet it head on and insist on advancing and scaling up policies, many of which we successfully began in 2020, that were actually working until these interests freaked out. So you all know what happened in 2020. I came to office in 2019, end of 2019, December 2019. 3 months later, city shutdown. And we faced a global pandemic. And let's start with acknowledging we did some things right as a city, especially in our public health response to this once-in-a-century health crisis, succeeding in politicians stepping back and letting public health professionals lead our response, and having among the lowest death rates from COVID of any city in the nation. So we also took some major steps, mostly out of necessity, early in the pandemic. And I want to be clear about these steps. Most of these are things that progressives, socialists, leftists, whatever you want to call us, radicals, have been talking about and urging for years, and incrementally moving toward, but not able to achieve quickly. So what do I mean by that? The city of San Francisco effectively banned evictions during the pandemic, said evicting people, especially for not paying their rent, is going to be a last resort, or it's not even going to be allowed. We're going to figure out other ways to resolve those disputes and get landlords their money. We are not going to evict people in City and County of San Francisco. So we banned evictions. I wrote over 12 pieces of legislation stopping evictions during the pandemic. The courts upheld them, things they never would have upheld outside of a pandemic, but in a pandemic, recognizing that it was life or death, the courts upheld our eviction bans. We launched an unprecedented rent relief program. San Francisco raised more money for rent relief to make sure that tenants not only weren't evicted, but didn't have crushing debt from the pandemic, and that landlords got paid, again, without going through evictions. As a result of all this, San Francisco saw evictions plummet. We had the lowest eviction rates of any major city in California during the pandemic. What else did we do during the pandemic that was working? We offered free health care connected with COVID. I mean, think about it. For all the talk about socialized medicine, think about how easy it was to access vaccines and boosters, and how we launched approaches like the Latino Task Force and others that were actually centered in communities and culturally competent care. Again, things, testing on demand, boosters on demand, right? Things that our healthcare system usually struggles to provide, and that many activists in this room and across the city have fought for generations. We were actually starting to do that in 2020. We funded workers, the Board of Supervisors, with, and huge credit to my colleague Hillary Ronan, who led the efforts to create a right to recover program to provide income to workers while they were recovering from COVID, something that our system generally doesn't provide to workers, right? We offered grants to struggling small businesses. We banned corporate landlords from evicting small businesses during the pandemic. I wrote, and we passed in San Francisco, again, upheld by the court, the only law in the nation that provided relief to those small businesses from back rent debt that was accumulated while their businesses were shut down by city orders. What else did we do early in the pandemic? We rented rooms, hotel rooms, the shelter-in-place program, and moved homeless people into those rooms. Now, there was a lot of fight about that. You'll all remember, between the mayor and the Board of Supervisors. But at the end of the day, San Francisco rented out thousands of hotel rooms and moved homeless people from the streets into hotel rooms. We piloted this first in my district, in District 5, with the Oasis Inn, where I reached out to the owner, convinced him to allow all the folks who were at a family shelter in my district, crammed together on mats on a floor, in the midst of a pandemic. We convinced that owner to try it. An unprecedented move, raise the funds privately because the city wasn't moving fast enough. And that became the pilot and the model, and then the city scaled up with shelter-in-place hotel rooms across the district. We acquired buildings for formerly unhoused people at a scale the city has never acquired, and that was because of a combination of Prop C money, which was achieved by taxing the rich, big corporations, to fund solutions to homelessness, as well as Project Home Key, the state effort. So we were acquiring buildings and converting them to supportive housing, like the Gotham Hotel in my district on Turk Street. So what we were doing was actually working, and shocked a lot of folks around the state that as a result of acquiring all these hotel rooms, moving folks from the streets into hotel rooms and acquiring buildings for formerly homeless people, San Francisco saw our homelessness rate drop 15% during the pandemic, from the point in time count in 2022. So the first 2 years of the pandemic, our homelessness rate dropped 15%. Think about that. That was at a time when our shelters were shut down. So initially in the pandemic, we had a huge surge of homelessness. Then we started housing people. And we actually, unlike most other counties across the state and everywhere in the Bay Area, we saw our numbers of people who were living on the street drop 15% during a pandemic when we couldn't use big congregate shelters. We reduced the jail population in San Francisco, in part because of our DA and because of a movement in 2020 to push back against mass incarceration, but also in part because of necessity. Because even the sheriff didn't want people crammed in, overcrowding in jails at a time of COVID, right? So there was some agreement in 2020 that people who didn't need to be there probably shouldn't be there, right? And we saw a significant decrease in the jail population. We diverted calls in 2020, coming out of the civil rights uprising after the murder of George Floyd. We started diverting 911 calls that were not police matters from police to crisis response teams led by the fire department and the Department of Public Health. We flooded, and sometimes this is controversial, but I generally supported it. We flooded some neighborhoods, particularly the Tenderloin and parts of the Tenderloin, with community ambassadors and other non-police alternatives. We did all these things and saw a reduction in violent crime in San Francisco. The very reforms called for by civil rights groups in the civil rights uprising following the murder of George Floyd, the reforms in 2020 were working. Though we had only scratched the surface of what could be done and what was possible. Another example, early in the pandemic, we made Muni free for all youth, universally and permanently. We almost launched a universal, fare, free Muni pilot, but the mayor vetoed it. We passed it at the board, the mayor vetoed it. But free Muni for youth was the consolation prize, and it is a huge step toward making transportation in San Francisco a right, not a privilege. And here's where it gets interesting. We also taxed big real estate investors and speculators to raise money for social housing and rent relief. So this was in the middle of the pandemic in 2020, and we were warned by every political pundit, people are not going to want to tax folks in this pandemic. Everyone's going to want to take a more cautious approach to our economy. Well, the pundits were wrong on that. They warned that no taxes were passed and no fewer than 4 taxes were on the November 2020 ballot. Some of them weren't polling so well. Guess what? All of them passed. Every one of them. I wrote Prop I, that's of those that was the tax on, doubled the tax on people selling $10 million real estate. And you can, the arguments against it, oh, what about the poor? I'm like, who is the poor person? I'm sorry, you own $10 million real estate in San Francisco, you're okay, right? You've probably been undertaxed for years. You're probably selling it for a huge gain. Like, I'm not gonna cry any tears for you, especially because we're trying to tax you to fund affordable housing and rent relief so that people aren't homeless in San Francisco, right? They outspent us 20-1. They spent millions of dollars attacking that ballot measure, and it passed decisively. It's already raised hundreds of millions of dollars. The other progressive taxes have Prop C, the excess CEO compensation tax, all these taxes passed. So think about that. These taxes, this is a story you generally will not hear, these taxes are a major reason why the predicted fiscal cliff and deficits that everyone was warning about early in the pandemic did not occur here in San Francisco, because we were taxing the wealthiest and raising hundreds upon hundreds of millions and holding off those deficits, which for the first time since I took office 3.5 years ago, this is the first year where we're actually facing deficits. And the reason we didn't have them previously is because we taxed the rich so successfully. So what followed, I go into all this because it explains what followed, and it can only be described as a billionaire backlash. So they understood that many of these social programs could only be funded and sustained through taxation of the rich. They saw what was happening. They saw that these things were working in our city, that these programs were working, the things that leftists and socialists and progressives have been calling for years, because of a pandemic and because of necessity, were put in place. Stopping evictions, helping workers who are recovering from illness, providing health care to people, right? They saw those things happening, and even scarier for them is they saw the voters in a progressive city like San Francisco say, hell yes. No matter how much money you throw to mischaracterize this, we have an appetite to tax the rich to pay for these things. And other cities started noticing. Okay? When we passed Prop I here in San Francisco, raising hundreds of millions of dollars, first call was from Los Angeles. They just did the same thing. What happens in San Francisco does not stay in San Francisco, which is why San Francisco is so often a target of the conservative press nationally. So I submit to you that the billionaire backlash loyally carried out by not just Republicans, but corporate Democrats, political careerists of no particular ideology, certainly Republicans. That backlash is the primary cause of the problems that we see today. And their deregulation, anti-government agenda is among the biggest threats that we face when we're talking about the future of San Francisco. They're not only reversing promising programs, but they want to launch new harmful initiatives, including massive disinformation campaigns, all to protect and expand their profits and control and prevent meaningful progress. So I want to talk more specifically about that. Consider the impact of this, what I've described as this billionaire backlash. The real estate interests and industry, the venture capitalists, tech billionaires, and worst of all, even worse than the billionaires like Musk, are the wannabe billionaires. Like, they only have hundreds of millions. They're guys like Gary Tan and others. They're very angry that they're not yet billionaires, so they're even more toxic. But these folks and the conservative interests, in full partnership with Mayor Breed's administration, sprung to action after the first 2 years of this pandemic. They shut down the shelter-in-place hotels over the objections of progressives is we're housing thousands of homeless residents. So when people say we need more shelter, they're absolutely right. Of course we need more shelter. But remember, we had shelter for thousands of people in shelter-in-place hotels. And rather than keep those open or find new ones to replace ones we were closing and have that path from the streets into a hotel to then be ready for permanent housing, instead, those things were shut down, not by the board, but by the mayors fully aligned with the billionaires and the interests I've described. So let's be clear. Homelessness has risen in San Francisco, not because of progressive policies. Homelessness has risen in San Francisco because we shut down the very places that people could go from being homeless. We shut them down. So it's not a surprise that homelessness would be on the rise. They replaced the reform district attorney that we had with a war on the poor prosecutor. Massively increased police budgets to ramp up the war on drugs, taking us back decades in terms of our approaches. Launched a huge campaign to arrest people for drug use. This is people who are addicted to drugs, who need a healthcare intervention, are now, at the request of billionaires and the rich and conservatives, are now subject to arrest and being thrown in jail, literally criminalizing their addiction. But again, it's not just a moral issue. What has happened? Crime's gone up. We recalled a progressive district attorney, replaced him with the tough on crime or whatever you want to call it, and crime has gone up. We unleashed the war on drugs and started arresting drug users, and crime has gone up. These things are not coincidences. They blocked affordable housing that could be housing thousands of working class San Franciscans, literally refusing to spend the money raised by voters through Prop I and other measures, and money appropriated by the board specifically to fund acquisition of housing for community land trusts, co-ops, and other forms of affordable housing. And as a result, working people continue to leave San Francisco in search of affordable homes. And perhaps most tragically, these interests demanded that the sole overdose prevention site in San Francisco be shut down without a replacement. 400 people a day were being helped at the Tenderloin Center, the only safe consumption facility in San Francisco that was stood up during the pandemic. 400 people a day. Every person who overdosed at the Tenderloin Center, hundreds of people, their overdoses were reversed. Not one died. That was shut down without a replacement. So what happened? UN Plaza turned into a mess because all the people who were consuming under supervision and with access to medical help, food, and connections to housing services, treatment, all those folks no longer had a facility to go to. So they do drugs out on UN Plaza. People complain about seeing drug use in public. We had a system where you didn't have to see drug use in public. People had a place to go. It's called a safe consumption site. And what's happened? We've had, since the closure of the safe consumption site, the Tenderloin Center, overdose fatalities have surged in San Francisco. That's not a coincidence. It was the reactionary approach to shut down what was working and not replace it with anything has actually led to more death. It is directly the cause of more people dying. And it's tragic, and it doesn't have to be that way. So that's the pattern here. Evidence-based solutions were working, and so they shut them down and launched misinformation campaigns to attack those solutions and declare them failures. In their place, they're pushing the war on the poor, and predictably, homelessness, crime, and fatal drug overdoses are on the rise. Billionaires have spent millions of dollars to reinvent history, again, blaming the solutions. You've all heard it. Blaming government programs, unions, rent control, tenants' rights, shelter-in-place hotels, harm reduction. All these things become, in their view, the reasons for failure when, in fact, those are the solutions. One of these billionaires is so desperate to own the narrative, he launched his own online newspaper, and I use that in quotes, that spews propaganda daily. This is the same gentleman who's a billionaire and is recently revealed to actually be trying to open his own city and take over hundreds of acres in Solano County to create his own company town, because I guess he doesn't like places where there's actually democratically elected governments that are holding him accountable. So I think it's important to remember, though, try as they may, they can't erase a key truth. There is actually facts and evidence. As much as Trump and others want to convince us they don't matter, they do matter. There are evidence-based solutions to our biggest problems in San Francisco, and we've demonstrated, as I mentioned early in the pandemic, that these solutions can work, but they have to be funded, and that is where the reaction from the wealthiest interests in this city and region come from. So we know what works: housing with support for homeless people, investments in things that keep communities safe rather than reflexively giving unlimited money to police and locking people away for longer and longer, overdose prevention sites to lower overdose deaths, public investment, eventually through a public bank, in affordable housing, small businesses, and green infrastructure in San Francisco, and yes, further taxation of the rich, who are, despite what you will hear from them, who are wildly undertaxed in our society. So these things I've just noted freak out the billionaires, but they work if allowed to operate, and no amount of corporate spin will change that. So where do we go from here? And let me just maybe try to pull some of this together before we move into Q&A. Where do we go from here? First, as I mentioned, we need to focus on evidence-based, proven solutions for community safety, like lifting people out of poverty and into housing, investing in violence prevention programs, street teams to intervene and help those who are struggling with addiction and mental illness, and safe consumption sites are a crucial part of stopping overdoses and connecting people to treatment and getting people into recovery. On overdoses, and our city's response really has been deplorable and counterproductive. We need to follow the lead of health officials on our overdose crisis and fully implement the overdose prevention plan. We worked very closely with the Department of Public Health, urging them to release this plan. They did. The mayor signed off on it. It's been a year. The cornerstone of that plan was opening wellness hubs or safe consumption facilities across the city, which the administration has refused to do. We need to go all in on these approaches, on evidence-based approaches like wellness hubs, instead of continuing to waste money on the exact opposite of an evidence-based approach. We are using approaches that have been proven to fail over and over again. Increasing police budgets to fund the arrest for people for their drug use is absolutely making things worse. Like, the war on drugs creates more overdose deaths, and arresting drug users, the studies show people are 40 times more likely to have a fatal overdose after release from jail. So our solution cannot be to lock people up because they're addicted to drugs, unless the goal is more overdose deaths, which I certainly hope it is not for anyone. Second, we need to focus on real solutions to homelessness and stop blaming the poor for their unhoused status. It has become far too common to hear people blaming the poor for their unhoused status and for their behavioral health issues, many of the behavioral health issues which intensify when folks are living through the trauma of living on the street. We have 1,000 vacant permanent supportive housing units in San Francisco. 1,000. These are fully funded units that people who are on the streets or in shelters could move into with the care and support they need, and they sit vacant. We need to fill them urgently, and that would be a major step forward. Last week, I introduced a resolution at the Board of Supervisors urging the Department of Homelessness and Supportive Housing to fill 50% of the vacant units within 90 days. And that will be up for a vote this week on the agenda, and on Tuesday, you're welcome to call in to public comment and voice your support for that resolution. We can and should and must fill these vacant units. We also need to continue to acquire new sites to house homeless individuals and families, just like we did over here just down the street at the Oasis Inn, just like we have done in other facilities. We cannot stop with those efforts. We need to increase those efforts. And I want to emphasize, homelessness is first and foremost a housing issue. It doesn't mean people aren't facing other issues, including potentially addiction, mental health, but none of those issues can be resolved or solved until people are safely housed. Housing should not be a commodity reserved just for those with the most money. It should be a right, the right of everyone to have a safe, decent, and affordable home. And I hope everyone agrees that nobody should be forced to sleep on the streets in a society that has the level of wealth that ours has. Third, I think we need to invest in our small businesses and also our neighborhoods, and recognize that our economy in San Francisco is not just downtown. And I think it's become all too common when talking about what the path forward in San Francisco is to only discuss this doom loop and the impacts on the downtown economy. We know that the downtown economy has changed dramatically. Work from home in the tech industry in particular has left vacant office space all over downtown. That is a reality, and we need a vision for the future of downtown. But we cannot allow the conversation about the vision for downtown to eclipse what is also the core of our economy in San Francisco, which are our incredibly resilient neighborhoods all across the city that are in the process of rebounding and never get the coverage they deserve because the national media is so busy exploiting the latest crime that they can catch on video downtown in San Francisco. So we need to focus on supporting our small businesses in our neighborhoods. Many of them really are roaring back. In my district, Japantown, the Haight, Hayes Valley, other neighborhoods are at levels that in some cases surpass pre-pandemic local business activity. And we need to be doing everything we can to support them. And again, we had grants early in the pandemic, like the Shines grants and others. We need to be looking at how to invest more directly in small businesses, especially minority-owned small businesses in San Francisco. And I believe very strongly that a public bank, which we are on the verge of introducing legislation on, is absolutely key to scaling up those efforts to invest in small businesses. Next, in terms of the path forward, we need to get serious about affordable housing for low-income and working-class people in San Francisco, especially if we're going to hit our housing element goal, which is 46,000 units, new units, of affordable housing over the next 8 years. So I am very proud that I've led the way at the board and the ballot to generate hundreds of millions of dollars for affordable housing. But we have been fought every step of the way by the mayor and real estate interests in that fight. And meanwhile, only 7% of union workers in San Francisco can afford housing here. That was a study that got no media attention that the labor community and affordable housers put exhaustively researched with UC Berkeley, finding that unionized workers in San Francisco, only 7%, 93% cannot afford to live in San Francisco. We cannot allow developers and corporate landlords to hijack the discussion of housing, pushing a trickle-down theory that urges us to prioritize market-rate housing as if it is a strategy to make housing affordable. It is not. Market-rate housing does many things. It can generate taxes, it can provide homes for people who are very wealthy, and it can provide investments for real estate investors and profits. It does not, cannot, will not, has never, and will never provide a home in San Francisco for a school teacher or a janitor or a retail worker, or increasingly even a firefighter or a nurse. Yep. So we have to prioritize truly affordable housing, and that comes in many forms: tax credit projects, BMR units, community land trusts, limited equity co-ops, municipal housing, and nonprofit developments. And most importantly, we need to massively scale up these efforts, building affordable homes, acquiring existing homes and converting them to affordable homes, and land banking to create an affordable future for our kids. Because land banking never seems to make sense to people today. And with hindsight, people always wonder, why didn't we do it? And we are in a down market. We should be buying up land left and right in San Francisco to create affordable housing so that our kids and our grandkids can actually afford to live in this city. All of that requires confronting and frankly competing with the dominance of real estate capital in San Francisco. Next, in terms of the path forward, and I can't emphasize this one enough, we have to address the state of media in our city. Right now, the media is enabling the hostile takeover by billionaires and corporate interests. This cannot continue. We need to support independent media, so whatever your favorite independent outlet is, donate to them, read them, share their stories, amplify them, and urge journalists, regardless of what outlet they're in, to cover the political PACs, the disinformation, and the money in politics for what they are. You just don't see enough discussion or coverage of that. So long as more conservative interests can put out a press release and have it reprinted without scrutiny in most major outlets, we will be inhibited from making progress. We're seeing that in the doom loop stories. Most media will not cover the many things that people have done to positively improve the lives of residents in our city, but they will circle like vultures to report the latest bad news on any corner and nonsensically blame progressives. We need to support and invest in independent media with urgency in San Francisco. And finally, we need to recognize the importance of next year's mayoral election. Thanks to the voters of San Francisco who approved the ballot measure that I wrote and put on the ballot, and it was approved by over 70% of the vote, we moved mayoral elections from the low turnout odd years to the high turnout presidential election years, effectively doubling voter participation in electing the mayor. So we did that. We changed the charter. We did the impossible. We changed the charter to make sure that more people vote and participate in electing our next mayor. So I'm very optimistic about our ability to have a more progressive mayor, if folks will run, because of that change. And so we're going to have over 80% turnout instead of about 40%. We need a mayoral administration free of corruption. We need a mayor who will bring people together to solve our problems, not just stoke divisions with press releases blaming others. We live in a strong mayor city. I mean, that is just the objective reality. And sadly, this mayor has too often sided with the largest corporations against the needs of residents of our city, and it's been a major impediment to progress. I want to end with this. I remain optimistic about San Francisco because I believe that most people here are compassionate and progressive, even though those who are not tend to disproportionately get more airtime. So we remain a city that's on the cutting edge. As I mentioned, we can and should launch a public bank and be the first city in the nation to do that. We can house thousands of homeless people with the care and support they need. We should and must open wellness hubs across the city for safe consumption and to save lives. We need to launch a robust social housing initiative in our city and stop wasting time, especially after voters have approved and funded that effort. And we need to continue to be a place of refuge for trans people, reproductive freedom, and immigrants. And I will say those who think they can simply erase all this through disinformation campaigns are they're mistaken and they're short-sighted. I don't think that the people of San Francisco are fooled as easily as big moneyed interests in this city seem to think they will be. And I am encouraged, or maybe I should say, I mean, beyond encouraged, I'm really inspired, not by what I read online, not by what's on Twitter and the latest Reddit that someone tells me about, but by the conversations that I have in the real world, by gatherings like this, by talking with constituents every day, by the acts of kindness and generosity and mutual aid that people show each other every day across my district, across the city, that powered us through the pandemic, of neighbors helping neighbors. That's happening all the time, and it doesn't get the attention it deserves. So I'll end there. Thank you so much for listening, and I'm looking forward to any questions or comments. It's great to be here with you. Do you want to step up?
These are all the questions that I've already collected. So at some point, there are some duplications in here, and it's unfortunate that I can't really remember. Haven't been able to quite sort all of them out yet. But at any rate, I'll begin with the first one I received. And as someone who considered this to be our city's biggest problem, the influx of fentanyl. How is this being handled? And is especially as a factor in causing a huge increase in homeless population.
Thanks for the question. Yeah, and I mean, how it's being handled is very badly, is the answer. And the problem is that it is essentially, first and foremost, a public health crisis and needs public health intervention. And until we do that, we are just chasing the problem around. And that's, there's always an initial. It's just the easiest thing in the world for politicians to do. And in my lifetime, I'm, over 50, and it's been the same thing over and over. It's just, you just announce a crackdown, give police more money, and act like you're solving the problem. It just doesn't solve the problem. So, until we approach the fentanyl crisis and drug addiction as first and foremost as a public health crisis, we're not going to make progress. And as I outlined before, some of the things we're doing are actually making it worse. It's completely irrational how we approach drug policy in this country and how we're approaching the fentanyl crisis. So there's so many things we could be doing. I mean, I'll give you an example. We proposed street dealing intervention teams, right? Everywhere else, with other issues in the city of crime, we have had the wisdom over the years to do things like the street violence intervention program. So when people were shooting each other in a neighborhood, we actually had teams that went out there and tried talking to people. Like, of course, there was a law enforcement side of it, but there's also a side of it that you mediate disputes. You find out, you talk to the leaders, you try to pivot people from the life of crime they're in to something else, right? That's what we as a city have come together behind and done in so many ways. We don't do any of that in the context of drug. Like, once the word drug is used, it's like the only response is police and arrests, and we need to be focused on and by the way, our street dealing intervention teams got shot down. The mayor wouldn't fund them. We don't even have anyone other than police going and running around arresting people. There is no plan whatsoever to address drug dealing on the streets of the Tenderloin or other neighborhoods. And in terms of addressing addiction, the preferred strategy right now from this administration is arresting people. It makes no sense whatsoever. And we're seeing, and I just can't emphasize enough, we're seeing the results. This is not just like ideology talking. This is like, the results are in. More people we're doing these things, arresting drug users, shutting down the wellness hubs and treatment centers. And as a result, more people are getting addicted to drugs, more people are dying. And we've spent enormous amounts of money on street level enforcement, and you talk to people in the Tenderloin, my constituents, and it hasn't had any major impact in improving conditions on the ground. So this is a public health crisis, and we need to intervene with urgency, led by the Department of Public Health, and I hope they'll find their voice, because so far they've been a little too quiet and compliant with this administration's more reactionary policies.
We have a huge pile here, I'm afraid.
Sorry.
Some of which will be duplicated, I hope. Did increasing taxes on the rich contribute substantially to the exodus from San Francisco? So this is a kind of counter question about progressive measures.
Right. So I don't think so, and I think that I've been involved in many efforts to tax the rich over the years. Folks who are, as I said, dramatically undertaxed in our society. Every time you tax the rich, they tell you that will be the final straw and they will leave. So every tax on developers, they say they won't develop. It is a strategy to push back against taxes. Doesn't mean it's not true in some marginal case, but I don't think it's the driving factor. The exodus is because of work from home. It's because of a pandemic that had major impacts on industry, and especially on what used to be sort of a requirement for these companies, which was to have that downtown office, right? You were that tech company with a downtown office in San Francisco. If you didn't have one, it's like, why don't you have one? But that's changed. People are working from home. They move somewhere that's much more affordable, and work remotely. So that's the driver. I don't think there's been some big exodus over taxes. But I can predict this. For the next year, you will hear that claim from every business nonstop, because they want to undo all the taxes, which, so that we don't continue to have those funds to solve our city's problems.
Here's a question. I would say in an ideal world, what's the plan for filling the 1,000 vacant supportive housing units? Is there a plan that could be put in place, I guess you'd say? To address the plan itself rather than the obstacles that we face.
There have been many statements by the Homelessness and Supportive Housing Department on how they are going to fill those. I think we've lost patience because it's now been 2 years where these rates are about 10% of the units are empty. That's why we introduced a resolution. There is one thing, and there was some coverage of this last week, that I do think is significant, which is a plan that HSH has. They just announced it a couple days ago to allow people to move directly from the streets into those units, as opposed to through coordinated care and through the shelter system, which has been part of the bureaucratic obstacles. They say that they are scaling that up. I believe that to achieve the reduction of 50% and filling half those units in 90 days that we have demanded from them, that they're going to have to do that. Move to more direct placements of people who are on the streets and are willing to move into housing. To do that immediately is really key, because a lot of it is the bureaucracy of first having to place them in shelter, then they go through a system, and it can take months.
Here's a numbers question. What is the current vacancy rate for retail and commercial property? What's the current vacancy rate in San Francisco for retail, commercial property?
Yeah, I don't know the overall vacancy rate on commercial, and it varies wildly depending if you're looking at downtown or neighborhoods, right? So we have the lowest vacancy rates we've had in years in the Haight Ashbury, for example, of storefronts, but the highest vacancy rates we've ever had in downtown office. But we can get you what the latest figures are on that.
Okay. I guess I would have thought that was the case just from the reading of the paper. How do you respond to folks who say that raising taxes drive, you've kind of done that one. Sorry. Is there a path forward? Here's another question I'll ask it. Sorry. Having a little feedback thing. Is there a path forward, a win-win, compromising with billionaires, or not? Derisive laughter.
Yeah, I mean, yes and no, right? On any individual initiative, sure, right? Like, billionaires, if they want to be part of the solution on some of these issues, can absolutely provide financial support, right? I mean, we just saw that, like Mackenzie Scott just gave $20 million to the San Francisco Community Land Trust. So she absolutely wants to be part of the solution. And so, like, I welcome anyone who wants to have those conversations. Mark Benioff has certainly done that in the past when it came to Prop C. But I think we also have to recognize the limits of that, right? There are two different ways that the wealthy can pay their fair share in society, and one is voluntarily and one is through taxes, right? And so while I applaud those who voluntarily are putting some of their money forward, and I think they mean well, and they're going to have a positive impact. And there's lots of examples of that, right? I mean, we had a huge donor come forward to St. Anthony's, and it's the reason we could buy the Oasis Inn for homeless families, all right? So that is a crucial part of our landscape. But I think we also have to recognize that we shouldn't be so dependent on that, on finding the one more compassionate billionaire to give the $20 million to make something happen, right? These folks are billionaires. Like, just stop and think about that. They have billions of dollars. They could literally solve most of these problems just by writing a check for 10% of their net worth tomorrow. It would have no impact on their lives, right? They could build thousands of units of affordable housing or solve any number of issues. And why are we asking? And, so we have some limits on how much we can tax, but these folks are not taxed anywhere near rates that other countries tax folks or that this country used to tax folks. And we've got to not, so I applaud and will always be, any billionaire that wants to talk about funding something in our district, great. Like, I welcome it, I applaud it, but it doesn't change the fact that structurally we need to be taxing billionaires and multimillionaires at much higher rates than we are. And I don't think that most billionaires will be a partner in that effort, right? Like, I think, maybe a few, but not many. Yeah.
This is
31, thank you.
wow. This is directly relates to your previous answer. Can you please name the top 5 billionaires in San Francisco?
I don't think I can name the top ones. I can tell you that one billionaire who isn't in San Francisco has certainly taken an interest in San Francisco. That's Mr. Musk, who likes to tweet about how he wants to get me out of the Board of Supervisors. So some of these folks, but no, I can say there are some who are, just to put names to some of these folks, I will name some who have become more politically active, right? So Bill Obendorf is an example of someone who has given a fortune, millions of dollars, to these various, there's a new political PAC every day, Neighbors for a Better San Francisco, and, Together SF Action, and like they have all these nice sounding names, but so he's been one of the major funders of that. Michael Moritz is a billionaire who's the one I referenced before, who's an investor in this California Forward, I think it's called, like an attempt to create a libertarian paradise or whatever over in Solano County, and he's the major force behind Together SF Action, and he runs the Standard website. So he's certainly a billionaire who's a major player. Others, Chris Larson has increasingly been investing in a lot of these campaigns. And again, Gary Tan is certainly someone, I don't think he's a billionaire, but he's certainly, a multimillionaire who's behind a lot of these efforts. So there's, it's not a huge list of people, but they're throwing incredible amounts of money into the political process and into media in San Francisco.
That still doesn't tell us who the villains are. What can be done to have the SFHA be more hands-on with public housing? What could be done to make them more hands-on?
So we have, I see Isaac, raise your hand back there. An amazing housing organizer from the Housing Rights Committee of San Francisco, who's actually been working with Plaza East residents. So if folks want to get involved, that's in our district. One of the big issues right now is what the repair of Plaza East is going to look like, and there are efforts to try to put market rate housing on that public housing site that are being challenged by residents there. So I think that just to answer that question a little more directly, the question is what can be done to make San Francisco Housing Authority more effective. I want to broaden it out that our experience has been, even on these housing authority projects, that the mayor's office of economic and workforce development and planning department and others are heavily involved. So I think it's not just about the housing authority, which has its own struggles and is understaffed and so forth, but increasingly, most public housing sites in San Francisco have been converted through the RAD program and other programs to actually not be purely public housing anymore, and so there's an increasing role of the mayor's administration. So I would just urge folks who are concerned about public housing, number one, get active on Plaza East, because we're gonna need you as those plans move forward. Talk to Isaac before this is done, but also to realize that some of these other departments, it's not all just the housing authority anymore, the way it was decades ago.
Here's a big, what is referred to as a big quick picture question. Socialism is inherently democratic. Why do we use the word democratic for socialism?
For emphasis. I think that's right. But I also think there are versions. I mean, you can have versions that are not democratic, right? You can. There's certainly nothing that precludes someone from rolling out socialist policies, but not in a democracy, or not just through dictatorship or other means. So I think part of the use of the phrase democratic socialism is to emphasize that it is it is through the democratic process that you're achieving those socialist objectives. So I appreciate the question, but I don't think it's redundant, I would say. I mean, I think, although in most cases, socialism comes about through democratic means.
Okay, here's a good question. I mean, not that the others aren't. What do we do with mentally incompetent people who are a damage to themselves and others, who refuse help from the city and want to stay in their situations?
Thanks. Yeah, those are extremely difficult situations. I mean, the law currently allows 5150 and conservatorship potentially for people who are a danger. 5150 for people who are a danger to themselves or others, conservatorship for people who are incapable of managing their own affairs. I think the question is, I think what ends up getting into the political space is the question of how you define those things and who decides, right? Because you're talking about the counterbalances people's individual civil liberties, that when you 5150, for example, you're taking away someone's liberty, and so you have to be clear who's making that decision. Is it a police officer? Is it a social worker? So making sure that you're not using those tools too aggressively for people who don't necessarily need those interventions. There certainly are people who need those interventions. I will say that there was an incredible amount of time and energy spent on conservatorship reform, and it became this huge hot button political issue that was bubbling up in my first year in office. And it went through, and I think they looked, and only 5 people in the entire city the new policies were even applied to. Sometimes I do feel like there's I get why the public sees someone who is severely mentally ill and thinks that, that the intervention, that we need more tools to intervene. The reality is we have a lot of those tools for severe cases. And what I think is really important is that we recognize that for the vast majority of people who are out there, overwhelming majority, are actually able to receive help, will take support, and I think there's sometimes a disproportionate focus on the small percentage who won't, who are either so severely addicted or severely mentally ill that they will not accept care. Some of those folks it may be appropriate for 5150 holds or other interventions, but it has to be a high bar if you're taking away someone's liberty in that way. So I think the tools are there. I'm open if there are things that need to be looked at to give more tools, but right now I think it's more a matter of doing the outreach and using those tools, and also having like ongoing. The most successful models are where you have ongoing support for people as opposed to a crisis response situation. That's often what we get. People call about a response, folks come out, and then people want to just automatically move that person into an involuntary hold, unless they're a danger to themselves or others. It's not an option at that moment. But often what that person needs is not just someone in that crisis moment, but someone to come back out that afternoon and build some trust and come back out the next morning. And by day 3, day 4,
Or year one.
Hopefully, and get folks housed. But to answer it, directly, there are absolutely cases where an intervention of that kind is required. I think we need to be careful about sometimes the calls are to dramatically expand the discretion of law enforcement to have those kind of holds. I don't necessarily want police officers in San Francisco, for example, deciding who gets an involuntary hold and who doesn't versus public health professionals.
Okay, here's a specific question about the Benioff tax Proposition C and how it is working now. How is it working now? Is it being collected? How much? Who decides? It is how it is spent. And how is this money being spent today? So it's sort of a multiple.
Yes, so it was collected for years while these big corporations sued to invalidate. So it was collected for years and held in an account. So for the first few years, Prop C passed in 2018. For several years, it was subject to litigation and not spent. Those funds are now being spent. Some of these acquisitions that you see, some of the positive things I described are funded by Prop C. Where we can get state money, we do, but some of the other things like the acquisition of the Gotham Hotel, those kind of things are absolutely funded by Prop C revenue. So yes, it's being spent. There's still a lot that's unspent. There is a body called the Our City, Our Homes Committee or Oversight Board. If Jembo's here, she might know its exact name. But what is it? Oversight Committee, thank you. And they make the recommendations on how the funds get spent, and the voters in the ballot measure had different buckets of funds, of like this much for youth, this much for families. And so that's all set in the ballot measure, but the committee makes the recommendations as to the more specific expenditures. There was an attempt, very controversial, in the budget process this year by the mayor to raid some of those funds. And it was rejected by the board, and a deal was worked out where those funds were not raided for other purposes.
Thank you. How do you answer the argument that all of the dysfunction, such as so much wealth concentrated in a few private hands, with the thousands of housing units standing empty, while growing numbers of people are homeless, as a result of not fundamentally a bad policy, but of the dysfunctional capitalist system?
Well, I'm the one Democratic Socialist on the board, so whoever wrote that question, not going to get an argument from me that some of this is absolutely, most of this is definitely inherent in a system, especially on housing, where we've completely commodified housing. And that's the fundamental struggle. And when you hear about this sort of like the YIMBYs and the developers and all that, and the tenants unions and the grassroots, affordable housing activists and others. Like that tension is fundamentally about to what extent the private capitalist market can provide the housing that people need, right? And we have gone to such extreme lengths in this country to commodify housing, to have people earn their wealth through investing in housing and it appreciating, to making people who are not owners completely unstable in their housing, right? So that they feel like they have to go into debt and buy because otherwise they're going to lose their homes and be forced out of their community. Like none of those models have to be, right? You can absolutely, other countries, a place like Vienna, more than half the housing is off the speculative market. It's social housing, right? And we could absolutely approach housing in that way. But I think it's pretty fundamental to capitalism to try to privatize these basic human needs, and housing, and in this country, land and housing are at the center of that. And the real estate industry has tremendous power. And I should just say, like, I am probably their least favorite politician for a reason. And for 20 years before I took office, I'm a tenant rights attorney. I ran statewide tenant rights organization and working with affordable housing folks all across the state. And I think people have clarity that the path to housing stability is not through developing more and more housing units for millionaires, right? And that's the path that the YIMBYs and developers and real estate industry want, whatever new name they put on them. So that's the path, and that's how they're generating wealth for themselves, through the housing market and through treating housing not as a human right, but as an investment in a commodity.
This is a nice kind of large question, and then I thought I would ask anybody who's sitting in the audience who has a burning question they'd like to ask. So this is, well, maybe I should ask if people are sort of waving their arms. I'll ask people now. Okay. San Francisco's fentanyl crisis has some roots in the environmental devastation caused by international and national corporations in Central America. Do you see any unique response path forward from San Francisco to that situation? Should I say it again? Or okay.
Yeah. No, I'll acknowledge the premise of the question. I think it's true. As to like what policy tools we really have at the local level to address that, I'm not sure I have. There is absolutely an international component, right, to drug trafficking, and certainly American imperialism and capitalism have, fueled that through a lot of our policies. And you see some of this playing out in the discussion around, the highly publicized Chronicle investigation around, around drug dealing in San Francisco, and discussion around, Honduran immigrants and so forth. And it's become, I think, what we have to do locally, and what I would respond, that's not exactly on the issue of like what we do about that, the international dynamic of the drug trade. But I will say that we have to resist locally what, unfortunately, I think my colleague from District 6 has really been pushing, which is to not address any of those actual factors, right, around the drug trade, and instead call into question things like our sanctuary city policy, start, speaking in what I think can only be viewed as xenophobic ways around some of the residents of our city who are visibly in the drug trade, but don't necessarily, and certainly don't represent, the entire community, Honduran community or others. So I think that's where I think our role as local electeds is to be a little bit of a firewall against what ends up being a lot of stereotyping of who's here involved in the drug trade in San Francisco. But I certainly would acknowledge and agree, and I do think for federal officials in particular, the dynamics of the international relations is probably more relevant question for like Congress folks and others on how they're going to navigate that. Thanks. Yeah, I think certainly District 1 and 5, Connie Chan and myself have certainly been identified, and they're already fundraising quite a bit against us. I think people really need to get actively involved in whatever campaign moves you, whether that's in the district you live in, or if your district is safe, getting involved in either our supervisor races or the mayoral race once the final list of candidates becomes clearer. Hopefully we have some additional entrants into that race, but people just need to get active. And look, there's always the stuff that political campaigns need, right? They need volunteers, they need and donations, but they also need just like people coming to events and talking to other neighbors, because there's no question we'll be like Connie and myself will be hugely outspent by these interests. Like, you just can't compete. They because of Citizens United, and like they can spend unlimited funds. So I have to call my donors, and I have like $500 limit, for what people can give. Musk's friends and Tan and what they can just write $10,000, $100,000 check overnight, right? So I think we need to raise the money. We need to compete. Like we have won. So I've won 2 hotly contested elections where we were outspent. I've won 4 ballot measures that I've led on, including a couple that the real estate industry spent millions against. We don't need to out fundraise our opponents as progressives, but we absolutely need to fundraise enough to run the basic campaign that we need to do, even if we're outspent, 2 to 1, 5 to 1. But really, at the end of the day, where we are strong, where progressive candidates are strong, is in talking directly with voters, meeting, whether it's like in someone's apartment or out at a community forum, door to door. And I can't emphasize this enough. Over and over again, despite all the spin, the issues that we are putting forward, the issues that socialists are putting forward and progressives are putting forward, are overwhelmingly popular, not just in my district, which is 90% renters and which tends to vote very progressive, but very popular citywide. And I just want, I have led on the 4 ballot measures that I mentioned, fought by the real estate industry. And we didn't just win in District 5, like all across the city by double-digit margins on taxing the rich, on creating a right to counsel for tenants, on taxing vacant residential apartments, like all these things that the industry absolutely fought, spent a lot of money to kill, and voters still support them. So us getting out and talking with people and I can't talk to everyone, so indirectly it's through our campaign volunteers who go and knock doors, and that starts soon. Because as you're saying with the I hope we're not behind the 8 ball, but I will say that we need every day of this next year in order to compete with what's going to be millions of dollars of digital ads, mailers, and attacks. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Dean Preston. This was a wonderful session, a great way to start off the new season of Forum, too. So please come back next Sunday. We have great sessions planned for you the next 4 weeks. Thank you so much.